Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. As many of you know, my name is Nina, and I'm Curator of Programs and Interpretation at the Williams College Museum of Art. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you today to our virtual series of curatorial close looks. I'm especially delighted to introduce today's program featuring the co-curators of our exhibition, Repro Japan, Technologies of Popular Visual Culture. We have with us today Christopher Bolton, Professor of Comparative and Japanese Literature at Williams College, Maggie Wu, PhD candidate in art history at the University of California, San Diego, and Eron Rauch, artist, writer, and curator. Before I turn it over to our wonderful presenters, I have just a few quick logistical notes. Today's conversation will run just about an hour. We will be taking questions throughout the program, so please do send those over to us at any point through our Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom navigation bar. And if you have any technical questions or you need any assistance, please send questions through the chat feature and we'd be delighted to help you. Live captioning is also available during the program today and can be turned on or off through the live transcript button on the bottom of your navigation. And that button has a CC on it. The presentation today is also being recorded and will be available on the museum's website and YouTube channel during the run of the exhibition. I will also love to invite you, any of you who are located in or near Williams, to join us next week on November 22nd at 7:30 p.m. at Images Cinema on Spring Street for the kickoff to our art and anime film series. Christopher will be introducing the 2019 romantic fantasy film, Weathering with You, and that screening will be free and open to the public on a first-come, first-served basis. We'd love to see you there. Finally, I would love to call us into acknowledgement that the Williams College Museum of Art and Williams College stand on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region, now called Williamstown, Massachusetts. Following tremendous hardship after being forced from their valued homelands, they continue as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, which is where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. As always, I encourage all of you joining us this afternoon from various regions to learn about the indigenous people of your own areas. I am now delighted to turn things over to Christopher, Maggie, and Eron. We will also share some additional biographical information about our three speakers through the chat feature. We will start off with a bit of introduction to the exhibition and its development before hearing the curators each highlight and discuss some of the works of art on view. An Edo period woodblock print, a 19th century photograph, an anime cell, and contemporary images of cosplay. We will be opening up to audience questions toward the second half of the program, but please do feel free to share your questions with us at any time. With that, I would absolutely love to invite Christopher Bolton, Professor of Comparative and Japanese Literature at Williams College, on screen to introduce himself and to share a bit about the development of the exhibition. Thank you all so much for being here.
Hello, thank you very much, Nina. I'm Christopher Bolton. I teach comparative and Japanese literature at Williams, and I'm something like the supervising curator for Repro Japan, and I'll talk at the end a little bit about this curatorial team. I'm going to start now with a very quick overview of the show. Repro Japan is an exhibition of Japanese popular visual culture across time, across media, and across the globe. It includes over 100 objects spanning 300 years from about 1700 to today in about a dozen different media. And the show focuses particularly on the technologies of reproduction and technologies of mass reproduction that have enabled the creation of popular culture, from woodblock printing culture in the 17th and 18th century through contemporary mass media. So this first slide that you're looking at now is a slide from, no, sorry, back up one, there we go, is a slide from one of the galleries that focuses specifically on explaining some of these technologies. In this case, it's color woodblock printing and contemporary 3D printing. You can see some wood printing blocks at the right there, and then a 3D printer set up at the left. Beyond these media, the different media technologies represented in the show include printed textiles, photographic work from the turn of the century onward, comics, animation, costumes, subcultural fashion, and a lot more. You can get a sense of the range of the material from this shot of the gallery here. Repro Japan is particularly interested in comparing these works to show the ways that each of these media technologies takes up the themes and also specific visual motifs of earlier media, and then reproduces or remediates those motifs in later media. So much of this work obviously is from Japan, but the show also includes many works of fan culture from around the world, showing how fans in different places have taken up Japanese popular culture and reproduced or repurposed it in various ways themselves. So today, two of my co-curators and I are going to take a look at three different works from the show belonging to, four different works, sorry, belonging to three different centuries. And we're going to trace some of the links between them. And here, we're actually trying to duplicate to some extent what it's like to stand in the gallery and see these works next to one another. But before I transition to this main event, I did want to say a quick word about the gallery design by David Gertscheim Morris of the Williams College Theater Department. The challenge in designing the gallery was to display all these different works and media in a way that would help the visitor make comparisons between them, including comparisons between works widely separated in time and possibly physically separated in the main gallery itself. And so David came up with this design that uses a very careful, let's see, could you back up one slide there? Yeah, David came up with this slide that uses a very careful arrangement of angled walls with gaps cut in them that lets you kind of focus on one grouping of works at a time, but also simultaneously glimpse other works, sometimes across the gallery, around the walls or between spaces between the walls or in these gaps that are cut in the walls. So if we look at the next slide, here's a close-up view of one wall with this kind of strategic gap cut in it. And if you move slightly to the left on the next slide, you can see it reveals more work across the gallery. So this process of comparison and successive revelation is what we're trying to recreate for you today in this presentation. Me and my two co-curators, Maggie Wu and Eron Rauch. I am sort of the coordinating curator for this show, along with Lisa Doran, who is Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs and Curator of Contemporary Art at the Williams College Museum of Art. Lisa and I had the privilege of leading this very talented team of curators, each of whom worked on a different section of the show. So Maggie curated the section on early photography, and she's going to talk about that. Eron, the section on modern and contemporary photography, and he'll get into that. Not with us today are Panali Mascati, who planned two sections of the exhibit on textiles and anime cells, and also Diana Tolan, who curated the cosplay costumes. So I'm going to introduce the first image in the sequence that Maggie and Eron and I are going to read together. So if we could look at the next slide, excuse me. Yeah, this is an 1823 print by Utagawa Kunisada from a series called A Mirror of Contemporary Cosmetics. And mirror here is a kind of pun. In Japanese, it means something like a catalog or a selection. So this was a series showing different images of women applying makeup. And obviously, it also refers to the literal mirror of the print. So I'm going to discuss very quickly some of the historical and technical background of this print very quickly, and then Maggie and Eron will each say a few words about it before moving on to the different images that they've chosen to compare with it. The show contains many examples of these woodblock prints from the 18th and the 19th centuries because they're arguably the first examples in Japan of mass visual media. Starting around 1700, Japan develops this technology to mass produce color prints, or which allows this mass production of fine visual art. So if we could see the next slide. This is another print from the show alongside one of the wooden blocks used to print it. So here you can see how each fine line of the outline of this figure of the no actor has been carved into that wooden block at right. And the block is then inked. You can see the black ink, and that's used to transfer the design onto the paper. And then if we advance to the next slide, you can see there are 8 other double-sided blocks just to create this one print. You can see hanging at left. Each of those blocks corresponds to a different colored area of the print. So the development of this technology, and we could go to the next slide now, coincides with, in this period, with the growth of cities, the growth of a merchant class and a merchant culture, and the growth of large urban markets to sell and market this kind of work. This period also coincides with the development of other new kinds of popular visual culture, like kabuki theater, like the entertainment culture of the pleasure quarters. And those visual cultures were in turn reproduced, or as I said, remediated in the prints, which the subjects of the prints are often the theater, the pleasure quarter, sports, and all these are represented in the show. So a print like this, although we tend to think of it as high art when we see it in a museum, was created as an object of mass consumption, often to advertise something. The prints often depict celebrities like kabuki actors or courtesans or athletes. And you could, in some cases, we think they fulfilled a role like posters do today. And you can see some examples of this in this print. Just one detail that I will call out. If you look at the envelope at the bottom right of the print, or the sort of bottom of the print under the mirror, and read the label, you can see it. That envelope contains a particular brand of makeup powder, the powder presumably that she's applying in the image. And the envelope also contains the name and address of the store that sold this powder in the period. So this was an example of product placement or a conjunction of the art ambitions of the prints and also advertising. So with that set up, I'm going to hand this over to Eron, who will say a couple words about the print as well.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. I'm Eron. I'll do a little introduction to myself a bit later when I get to the contemporary photography work. But one thing that I find really fascinating about this image, as a photographer, I'm very interested in optics and capturing contemporary moments. And if you really look pretty closely, you actually realize this mirror that you're looking in can't be the one she's looking at, because her eye line's off to the other side, so she'd be just applying makeup all over. And given how you can see her back, it's clear there's a doubling of the mirror going on. So yeah, when we think of a contemporary photo, like advertorial kind of thing, where it's like gonna feature some makeup or whatnot, we kind of like try to connect with the model, like you're trying to project onto it, and it's like a projection of desire. But one of the things I find fascinating about contemporary media art, and to me, the inclusion of the advertising in this is kind of a pop art strategy as well, a way of documenting contemporary culture of the moment. But I always find that these media savvy presentations of reproductive technologies are very fascinated with their own circumstance. And I'll get more into this later in my talk, but with this doubling of the mirror, there becomes this complex of like inviting like a critical analysis of identity production and the labor of identity production and the performative acts of identity. And the mirror ends up being this metaphor in a way for reproduction technologies in general, but also specifically for the camera. And that's what I'll be getting into in my section. But I want to pass it over to Maggie, who's going to speed us through the interim 150 years of photography.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie, and I'm a PhD student at UCSD working on themes of materiality and temporality. I actually graduated from Williams, the grad program in art history in 2019. So I'm really excited to be back with the community, even if only virtually. Can we go to the next slide? So my project really evolves around this idea of comparing the woodblock print and the 19th century photography that was taken mostly by Western photographers. So here, between these two prints, we can see a clear inheritance of trope we see that the two women are engaged in similar actions. The general color scheme is very similar. We also see a similar composition, as Eron has just mentioned. The print is also using a double mirror. And here in the photograph, the vignette is also in the shape of a mirror or perhaps a window through which we look at the woman. So some context here, the photograph is titled Woman Using Cosmetics. It's taken sometime between 1866 and 1868 by Italian-British photographer Felice Beato, who arrived in Japan in 1863 and opened his commercial studio. The photograph is well known for being a part of his album Views of Japan, one of the first tourist albums produced in and about Japan. It documented both Japanese scenery and local customs, mainly for the consumption of Western people. So existing interpretations of this photo in particular tend to focus on the power relation between the photographer and the woman model. They often criticize its imperial and colonial implications. And indeed, we can see here that the woman in Beato's photograph has a rather bored and blank expression, which seems to suggest an oppressive state. So in the print, we can see that the woman is pretty much absorbed in her application of makeup, not really aware of the artist or us, the viewer. Even if the squinted eyes are just common stylistic features for the ukiyo-e, for us, the viewer, it does convey a clear sense of concentration. However, in the photo, we see the woman have a rather bored and blank expression. And she also is not actually looking at the mirrors or applying makeup. We can see that she looks straight to the left, but the mirror is tilted to show us her face. If we can go to the next slide, this is an example showing you like the correct angle you should be looking at if you were truly applying makeups. And what does it tell us? It means that the model in Beato's photograph at this moment is only posing and not really acting. She can be seen just as the rest of the paraphernalia. She is a prop and not really an agent. Her lack of expression enhances this impression that she is an object and not a subject with feeling. In other words, we get the impression that she lacks interiority or subjectivity. But again, I feel like, why do we ask about subjectivity in the first place? Isn't this inquiry for subjectivity also a little bit colonialist in the sense that it asks for total knowledge of the subject? On the other hand, is subjectivity or agency simply defined by a visibility of emotion or active movements? If we can go to the next slide. I want to talk briefly about the significance of cosmetics in Japanese culture. So many Japanese scholars, such as Jody Cobb and Toby Slade, have observed how Japanese women, prostitute or geisha or courtesan, they always show little emotion, except practice formulaic expressions whenever they are fully made up. This highly stylized makeup, which covers the entire face by white, evens out every face that it covers, which should be seen as a concealment rather than simply an erasure of their identity. It is, in fact, a shield. It directs our attention to her makeup and performance, but also stops us there. Her surface becomes her only identity accessible to us, and there is no true self to be sought by a voyeur. Her self-coloring is not simply catering to a male aesthetics, but also an act of transformation, of shutting and blocking herself, at least partially, from the intrusive, inquisitive, and possessive gaze. Thus, we can make the argument that the self-coloring woman is not simply performing on command for the photographer. The moment she colored her face in white, which most likely happened before the photograph was taken, she already started her performance. And we see the same performative gesture on another level, which is the color applied to the photo. If we can go to the next slide, we can see that the colors really block rather than illustrate the reality. We can no longer tell what these objects are. At some point, such as a green spot, the colors flow over its designated spot. In other words, the photograph only provides a guidance, but it is not strictly followed. The things the colorist chose to color and the colors he selected could not be explained by him simply being directed by a colonialist desire for otherness. If we can go to the next slide and click one more time. So why would he put the brightest yellow not only on a pipe, which at least carried some, let's say, oriental flavor, but also on the two sticks behind the teapot and the base of the mirror? Whatever his intention, the effect he renders is an image colored here and there. Unlike taking a photograph, when a photographer looks into the viewfinder, and unlike painting an illusionistic work, where at least one could imagine oneself creating space and depth, coloring on a photograph does not allow for, and in fact doesn't need such spatial imagination. Coloring a photograph means working with a flat surface of a print. So in this case, a singular, static, scientific Western perspectival order, that is the operative principle of photography, is challenged by the colorist who scattered multiple focal points across the pictorial surface. Thus, by unearthing the deeper reason for this lack of interiority, rather than just criticizing the print for the lack of it, we can even discover a latent subversive energy in operation here. I will now turn to Professor Bolton to talk a little bit more about the anime cell.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Let's see. Okay, we're looking at the cell now. I would like to compare the Kunisada print with this. This is an anime cell, which is a painted image used to produce motion animation. So you may be familiar with the way these work. Successive still images are painted on these cells and then photographed in sequence on successive frames of film to produce a moving figure. Let's see. For the Zoom controllers, I'm still seeing Maggie's still frame as the speaker rather than mine. So I'm not sure if folks can see me, but I think you can see the the cell image. Here in the next slide is the animation this cell was used to produce. There it is. This technology of cell animation has a lot in common with photography, but also some things in common with woodblock printing. So there are a number of interesting features of this technology that I could talk about a little bit more in the Q&A if folks are interested. But here, I think I'd like to focus on a comparison with the woodblock print. So we could advance the slide to the next print. There we go. The first similarity is one of topic. Paneli Mascati, as I said, curated this section of the show and combed through hundreds of anime cells and thousands of prints to get these, find these kind of common motifs. In this case, the mirror. But there's no shortage of images like this in animes or in prints. And here we might ask why this mirror motif is so enduring. So one answer, kind of along the lines of some of the things that Maggie started with, is this topic of the beautiful woman, which dominates woodblock prints in the 18th and 19th centuries, is still a dominant theme in popular culture today. It certainly has to do a lot with catering to the desires of consumers, often male consumers. So the mirror, I think, is an excuse to watch these beautiful women becoming beautiful. There's also often an element of privacy or intimacy in these scenes, just as with Maggie's photograph. And so it satisfies a kind of voyeuristic desire, I think, on the part of these consumers. The mirror then becomes this device to sort of spy on these figures, at their toilette and see their faces, perhaps without feeling that we are being looked at or looked at ourselves. And I think pursuing this idea of this desire for access, you could say that the mirror multiplies what we're able to see. We can see the face and the back of the neck in particular, which is always a very kind of sexualized zone in these depictions. So I definitely want to acknowledge these kind of voyeuristic dynamics, which Maggie started with, and which are often part of a popular visual culture and many times and in many places. But I'd also like to push beyond that and see some of the mirror's other functions, the kind of formal functions in the composition of the print, just as Maggie did with the mirror and the color in her photograph. So there's a real artist's interest here, I think, in the possibilities of framing that the mirror introduces, and the way it lets the artist play creatively with the image. Kunisada portrays two different mirrors, in fact, so that both of the views of the woman that we see from the front and from the back, they're both images or depictions that might make us think of these kind of layers of mediation and remediation that we're tracing. And I think Eron is going to pick up more on that idea as we go forward. So we're talking about remediation from the print to the photograph to the cell to later works, but in many ways Kunisada's print contains remediation already in itself in the mirror. We're not seeing the woman, but we're seeing her reflection or the reflection of the reflection. I wanted to call that out. But the thing I would really like to call attention to in relation to the anime cell and get back to this comparison is the way that the mirror gives these media, these flat media, a kind of third dimension. So both of these media, the woodblock prints and the anime cells, are in some senses very flat. They are sort of media of layers. In the case of the anime cell, these cells are often constructed of multiple layers of celluloid, each of which has a different part of the image on it that are then sandwiched together for the photograph. For example, there's a background layer that goes behind this cell, which portrays the furniture and the frame of the mirror itself. In terms of the woodblock print, we could think of the layers of the wood blocks that lay down successive layers of color, or we could think of the area of the print, which kind of staged as a foreground and a middle ground and often a background. You could think of the layer of the mirror there in front of the layer of the envelope of cosmetics. The mirror as a motif then works very well with these kind of layered media that present depth in this kind of series of staged foreground and background. Finally, and my last point, beyond this idea of adding depth, the mirror also, I think, adds even a sense of motion. Well, how does it ask that? How does it accomplish that, you might ask? Well, anime is a way of portraying a moving figure, but as you can imagine from having to paint all those different images and sequence them, it's a very kind of labor-intensive way of portraying motion. So portraying a lot of motion is very expensive, and anime cells and cell painting has developed various strategies for portraying motion without with a limited number of cells. So one of the things that's very difficult in particular to do with anime is rotation, to rotate around a figure. That would require just an exorbitant number of cells and a lot of careful painting. And so when we watch this figure in the mirror in the anime clip, we are able to kind of figuratively rotate around from the back to the front by occupying both those states at the same time. So it gives the anime image, the mirror gives the anime image not only a sense of depth, but a sense that we can actually move in 3 dimensions, I think, through the scene. And that's the way that I want to finally come back to form and what this the mirror is doing formally, and link it perhaps back to that idea of the content and just wanting the viewer always wanting to kind of see more, wanting to be more mobile in the scene and be able to witness even more stuff. So I think Eron is going to take some of these ideas and even run with them further in his presentation as he takes us into the world of contemporary photography. Eron?
Yeah, hello there. So as mentioned, I curated the contemporary photography section of the exhibit, and I actually had in my personal notation, I like to call it the contemporary connections section. Particularly because I was originally brought in as just an artist. They were originally going to feature some of this work, which is a documentary project called Bridges of Desire, which charts the early American cosplay scene from about 1999 to about 2007. And I quickly realized that to draw out these connections in the rest of the show, I would have to bring in a host of global contemporaries. And we have a really amazing selection of artists that we ended up kind of all pooling our heads together to pick out that look at costume and fashion and desire that roll forward all of these tropes and themes and motifs and patterning. But specifically today, I wanted to look just at this one image here that they had actually picked out for me to talk about, which is a photograph from that documentary I mentioned of a group of cosplayers getting ready for the convention judging, where they're going to be ranked, possibly win awards, for a group of Paradise Kiss cosplay, which Paradise Kiss is fascinating because it is actually a manga / anime about fashion students, contemporary fashion students particularly. But one of the things we've talked about is these doubling of mirrors. And for those of you that maybe know about photography, this will be redundant, but angle of incidence equals angle of reflection is the typical way that you actually talk about what you see in a mirror. So the angle you're looking into a mirror is the angle that you're seeing out the other side. And so in this case, in this image, one of the important things to note is you're not actually seeing the woman who is using the mirror, you're actually seeing the guy on the upper right. And so what's interesting about this to me is it kind of highlights the way that the mirror always serves as a metaphor for the camera, particularly in documentary images, particularly because it makes us aware of the process of looking, right? The people in the image are utilizing this. They're utilizing the mirror specifically to attenuate their own actions, right? As production of identity, right? They're trying to make sure their makeup's okay, their costume's okay. They're trying to make sure that their performative act is correct. And in this way, that you're kind of always having to double in is suddenly a depiction of the performative act of identity. And particularly, this is extra fascinating to me, and this is part of the reason that cosplay became kind of my subject is, right, it's not just a depiction of someone pretending to be something or getting ready to be something. It is a depiction of someone who's translated a 2D something into a 3D something using a 2D thing to judge it, with me taking another 2D thing of it. And in that way is like, I like that complexity, because the reason I called the project Bridges of Desire is I quickly realized that desire is a sort of gap. In this case, at the conventions, right, you have these swirling thousands of people, all of who are maybe a little not super social, and all of whom are just a little bit horny, if anyone knows any fandoms. And the visual, this performative identity, these acts became a model for communication across these gaps. You have all these people that want to communicate. They all want to be in the place together. There's like palpable energy at these conventions, especially in the early days when they weren't so commercialized. There was a real just kind of anarchic festival atmosphere, but it was hard to tell who liked the same thing as you, who shared a similar ethos as you. And I really focused in on cosplay because it became, what's a good way to put this? Cosplay became the mirror of desire. It became the place that modeled and mirrored fans' identity to get as close as possible to the thing they were a fan of, to the media. And it's actually fascinating, and this is a much longer conversation that I give, is about how that gap of desire, that mirror model, actually produces interesting space with the documentary photographer. I actually call this my breakup project with anime fandom, because in a way, by stepping out and constantly depicting the archaic ley lines of desire, all the different ways the mirror and the costume and the commerce and the camera kind of twine together to create this really intricate structure, the further I felt actually outside as an artist. And that's sort of where my curatorial and writing practice actually jumped off from, was trying to explain like, what was this my own gap that I was finding, not just the gap between the mirror and the desired identity and the fandom, but what was happening with the camera. And the mirror really in this way became a metaphor for the camera. And yeah, so I realized I totally baffled probably the person who's running the slides, because I talked about, I did not get to any of the other slides, but I figured this actually dovetails nicely with what both Christopher and Maggie had talked about. And so I wanted to kind of tie it a little closer back in. And so I was actually going to invite both of them back in to maybe talk a bit about this image from not such a close space as me, but through that historical lens they've used for the prior two sections. And I'll let whichever of you go that you'd most prefer. Burning with desire, with cosplay desire to make this happen.
Maggie, would you like to start?
Yes, sure. So as I just hear Eron talks, I found something really interesting is that you just said the mirror reflects the guy's face rather than the person actually using the mirror. So what I found fascinating here is that mirror in art is often used to reveal a part otherwise hidden from the viewer. So in the case of my 19th century photograph, the mirror is used to show you the front of the woman's face, while in the photograph, she's only showing her profile. But here we are kind of seeing the doubling effect of the face of the guy in the back, in that we are already seeing his face, but then that face is further reflected in the mirror. What we are not really seeing is the, as we have talked about, the person using the mirror. So I feel like this hints at almost the unknowability of the entirety of the scene, or even the limit of technology, or the limit of mirror, the limit of the different tropes, that I just think is really interesting.
Yeah, I'll just follow up on that very briefly. It also took me a long time to realize that the image in the mirror was the guy's face in the upper right. I think maybe Eron, you had to tell me that. But for me, what it points to is the documentary quality of the project, that it's not posed. You didn't arrange people or place the mirror falsely so that you could get a certain view, but you positioned yourself in the room to put something interesting in the mirror. And it just speaks to the amazing quality of this whole project, which is hundreds of photos from dozens of conventions over a period of years, and just the amazing moments you were able to capture just by maneuvering yourself into the right place at the right time without posing your subjects. So I think that's just one thing I wanted to admire about this project.
I'm going to take 2 seconds here just to explain how I got this photograph, because it's a fun story. I am actually a member of this cosplay group. I am playing George, the sort of ringleader of these fashion students, in a blue plaid suit with a blue plaid hat. And I had basically traded access. And so when you're talking about, like, the mirror is often used in woodblock prints to show something you can't see, usually like some version of like erotic angle or similar in anime. The mirror in documentary photography works very differently, because the mirror showing someone getting ready in a mirror shows you that you don't know what that identity is that you're looking at, right? That, like, it highlights the thing you're not supposed to see, which is that you don't actually know anything about someone from seeing a photograph of them, right? And in this case, I actually had to agree to be George because I fit the costume, and their George was sick. And so I actually was able to trade that performance into access to backstage areas where most people didn't have access. And the cosplayers, by the way, loved having documents of their labor of identity production. This project is, the art world is like, how can you exploit them so? And the cosplayers that I know, who I'm still friends with a lot of them, are like, oh my God, I'm so glad someone took photos of how hard we work. This takes so much work to make it look seamless, to make it look organic, to like represent a 2-dimensional image in a way that is iconographic enough for fans to love it. So yeah, so anyways, you can actually, if you roll forward 1 slide, you can actually see 2 slides, 3 slides. Yay, 3 slides. That's actually me at another time being roped into playing George. That's the only 2 times I've ever cosplayed, and both times I traded playing George for access to backstage photographing. So
it's a great story. All right, I think we can invite Nina back in and open this up for some of the Q&A.
Thank you all so much for that. That was fantastic. And I just so enjoyed hearing and getting a little bit of a deeper taste of all of these works in the exhibition. And I do, of course, want to invite our attendees to also please share your questions in the Q&A feature. But while we're waiting for some of those, I had a couple questions that I'd love to kind of start us off with. I'd love to, I think, actually pick up on something you just shared, Maggie, that I loved, this idea of the way in which the mirror sort of signifies the limits of technology. And I was hoping that maybe, thinking about the sort of the span of time that the exhibition looks at over a number of centuries, maybe ask the three of you to speculate a little bit with us and with our audience about the ways in which, continued developments in technology might actually continue to shift the ways that some of the motifs and themes that we're looking at might be changing. And I am thinking, Christopher, also about, like, for example, we didn't talk about it today, but the 3D printing that features in the exhibition. I'm also thinking about things like social media, or even the ways that some technologies of printing or photography or documentary might be changing the ways in which we tell stories and circulate stories. I'd just love to sort of hear any, sort of nascent thoughts about that.
I'd really like to hear from Eron on that, because I think your contemporary projects, Eron, are relate to video games, which is one area that the exhibition kind of comes up to and touches, I think, with some cosplay of video game characters. And a little bit of video in the gallery, but not too much on gaming. So I'm wondering what you think of gaming, the way gaming is going to change some of this stuff.
As he just called out here. No, Christopher is particularly referring to the fact that the other major through thread of my career has been virtual photography. I'm very fascinated by depictions of images in virtual spaces, typically video games. And I just, to roll this forward, for instance, during the pandemic, many of you may have played Animal Crossing, maybe something else. Final Fantasy XIV is probably one of the biggest online role-playing games right now. And World of Warcraft also remains one of the top online role-playing games. But for instance, just to draw a quick connection, one of the fundamental things that fans in those spaces do is collect costumes. So virtual costuming, whether it be in World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV, which particularly Final Fantasy often draws from almost identical historical roots in both photography and patterning, traditional Japanese patterning, in fantastical and Baroque ways that are unbelievably spectacular. But even in things like Second Life, where user-generated platforms, fashion and avatar design become one of the primary driving industries. So yeah, absolutely. I think these things are happily moving forward into 3D models of all kinds.
So we do have one interesting work in the show, a cosplay photograph by Joseph Chi Lin of a cosplayer, Melinda Chan, who's cosplaying a character from Final Fantasy, I think, is it 14? Mm-hmm. So there you have the virtual costume of the game recreated by the cosplayer in real life, then modeled by her, and then finally photographed by the cosplay photographer, photographed in a way that kind of makes the photograph look like it is taking place back in the game. So we kind of come full circle.
Yeah, 3D environments are becoming a part of cosplay photography. 3D environments and props and effects. So you're actually seeing people do a lot of, like, for those of you who've seen a Marvel movie, like 90% of every frame is pretty much 3D that's just had actors in it. And a lot of those techniques are now very available to a prosumer. And so you'll see, yeah, real cosplayers shopped into a 3D model of environment with 3D prop weapons, or using models from games to print 3D printed versions of things that they need. So there's a lot, yeah, it gets a lot more actually really fascinating and intricate and creative and challenging. I wish Diana was here. She could talk a lot more about some of that stuff.
Diana Tolan is our cosplay curator for the show.
Maggie, did you have anything you wanted to add or share?
Yeah, I just think it's really interesting how Eron's photograph in the 19th century photograph by Beato, there is a century gap between them, right? And we already see that the camera is becoming smaller and smaller in a sense that it enables Eron to go into the room and photograph whatever interests him at the moment. When Beata was taking a photograph, the process also it has improved. When it was first invented, it was still really it was still like not that easy to do. Like a model has to stay in front of a mirror for like at least 30 minutes. She has to hold completely still. So I think this technology that the camera is getting smaller and smaller, the development time is getting quicker and quicker. It kind of like almost feeds into our desire to capture everything at the moment and to just basically see the entire world as visual materials instead of just assembling a mise-en-scene and then capturing it. So I find like that transition is pretty interesting, and I can just imagine like with today's smartphones and some like mini cameras, that's just gonna take us further into this direction.
Yeah, and my project is kind of the tail end of that evolution. So I'm just old enough that that entire project was shot on super high speed black and white film because that was the only way I could shoot. Like as Maggie's talking about, like that project go back 75 years and you really couldn't make that project because film wasn't sensitive enough, the chemicals weren't good enough. And it switched to digital like right after that project finished. And now it's like there's a degree of seamlessness. Like the grain's an indicator of like how hard it was to get those images. They're kind of like turning the gain up really high in a microphone. You can kind of hear how it's crunchy. But now most cameras, yeah, they have that, especially your iPhone with all the processing it does behind the scenes. Like it is giving you the fiction of pure seamlessness. It is Beato's dream of like pure seamlessness. Everything looks perfect. Everything looks completely like it just happened in front of the camera, despite using 75 years of advanced computing technology to make it look so perfect.
Yeah, that's so
That's a
fascinating.
good observation, Maggie.
Yeah, I love what you shared, Maggie, and all of you. And I mean, I just can't help but, in listening to all of you talk about mirrors, also just be very aware of like, the digital platform that we're on, where we're also, this relationship between looking out into the world and also seeing yourself reflected back, which I think, certainly social media also plays such an interesting role in as well. We have some really great questions coming in through the chat, so I'd love to take some time with those. We have a question from Jonathan asking, first saying what a great presentation you all had, but asked if you could talk a little bit about the interplay between 2D and 3D within the exhibition. And asking, as curators, are you giving us a 2D or a 3D experience, and how do you mediate between the two? I think that's really interesting. I'll just add there, I think, hearing all of you talk a bit about the way in which the images that you all talked about create sense of motion, I thought was so interesting. And it also made me think about the way in which within the space of the exhibition, Christopher, your really close work with David Gersay Morris really creates these very interesting pathways and directions of movement within the space of the gallery. So would love to hear a little bit about that interplay between space, 2D, 3D objects.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple ways to answer that. One is to, we have kind of focused on two-dimensional objects for the presentation today because they translate the best into this 2D format. But the exhibit, the show does try to have a rhythm between these many two-dimensional objects starting in the Edo period and more three-dimensional objects, the costumes, model figures, 3D printing, subcultural fashion. So I think there's a rhythm in the gallery between the 2D and 3D works, which, as we discussed with the cosplay examples, are often kind of interchanging with each other. The one a depiction of the other. We have a beautiful Lolita dress by an Argentine designer. And the prints on the fabric for the dress are drawn from the woodblock prints and fabric stencils elsewhere in the exhibition. So we have that kind of exchange going. The other way to answer that question is sort of, as you alluded, Nina, to talk about the movement through the gallery. And I'm very interested in kind of making the the visitor conscious of where they're standing and their physical relationship to this art, instead of just being kind of a disembodied eye that, you know, gazes on a painting. So having to thread your way around the walls or look around the walls or see through the gaps is part of making you kind of conscious of your own subject position, basically, to connect it to some of the things that Erin and Maggie were talking about.
Erin, Maggie, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I do think the idea of virtualized space is really important. Like, you know, we use virtual typically to mean 3D CG, but one of my opinions is that, or not opinions, one of the things that I've done a lot of writing and research about is that media reproductions, whether it's woodblock prints, but especially photography, are based in virtualized imagery. So you can go all the way back to the beginning of photography, and like I've got a picture over here of the Nesmith brothers' infamous moon shots. They produced an entire book of moonscapes. They're some of the first people to produce moon photos, except they're all made up and entirely produced as little 3D models based on looking through a telescope because the technology wasn't there. And as you go through photo history, whether it's spaces or people, you know, Juliet Margaret Cameron's depictions of the Arthurian mythos using famous figures from Britain at the time, there's always this interplay between virtual and quote unquote real, but like with the virtual actually being the depicted gap. You know, I was talking about desire being a gap, and I think virtualization is kind of the negative space shape you see there, and that's what I love about the design of the show. I'm hoping to get there to see it. I'm actually based in Los Angeles, but I love that idea that it's virtual, like it's virtualizing all the connections in a very like physical way.
I guess I would just add to that and just say that although the photography, I agree, is very much in all the virtual, at least everything in the gallery we're seeing, they're all material objects, right? There is a materiality to it. No matter how thin the paper is, it's still a 3D object, in my argument. And I feel like this is something that I myself find challenging in my product is that I never actually saw the woman using cosmetics print in person. I never was able to touch it or to flip over it or just to look at it, even if my entire argument kind of rests on this materiality of the color. And I think this is something I guess we can all think about, like this tension between the virtual and the material, and like what is more important, or like what like just maybe not was more important, but just their tension with each other. And I think at least for my print, at the moment you are touching the photograph to see whether the color could be removed, and this might be driven by a desire to know what's underneath. I think the moment of touching instantly pulls you back from the illusionist reality. I mean, from the illusionist scene that you are in a Japanese dream or whatever, it pulls you back from that dreaming process into the reality by that touch of the material objects.
Yeah, just a final tag to that, like it's an interesting feature of designing, curating a show, that it is all virtual or largely virtual until the moment that the art arrives. And that and this show was modeled in a three-dimensional modeling software to get the lines of sight right. A lot of the art, which might have come from abroad, was chosen based on web images. We did go to some museums to, you know, scout the art, but we had not seen it all until the day it arrives. And then, so to have this virtual object suddenly become real or physical, as Maggie said, within the 2-week installation was, yeah, very striking, very exciting.
I just posted a book that's very, very cool about pointing out how, like Maggie was saying, things we tend to call virtual or 2D are actually usually extremely haptic. It's all about like interfaces with video games, but it talks about how, yes, it's a very sweaty, hands-on, like your phone's all slimy and gross. So yeah.
I love
I
that.
think we had one other question.
Yeah, we do, and it's a big one. So I am mindful of everyone's time, but I will ask it. I think it's Tortoise was asking about have there been changes in the way women are depicted that reflect recent changes in their options in Japanese society. And I want to thank you all for speaking about also the sort of gender dynamics of some of these images, and also the idea of voyeurism, which I think, Christopher, you spoke about. Yeah, I don't know if there are things you might want to say as we also think about these works that sort of transcend different media and time.
Maybe Erin or I, well, any of us could maybe touch on. Well, there's interesting works by Sawada Tomoko in the exhibit, and also Mori Mariko, two of the kind of best known contemporary Japanese photographers, both women, and both of whom are photographing themselves, but in these kind of contexts which reference cosplay or subcultural fashion. So there's, I think they are some kind of trying to answer Tortoise's question in a sophisticated way by cycling themselves into these regimes of representation and then becoming the model and the photographer. And Erin, I think, might speak more eloquently on their work than I can. But maybe I should describe one of the things. So Sawada Tomoko has this a grid of photographs of herself dressed in these kind of subcultural fashion known as Lolita, which is a kind of a fashion subculture that some Japanese women have adapted, that is a kind of Japanese take on a Victorian or Baroque fashion, a kind of Victorian China doll type of aesthetic. It's not maybe a mode that looks feminist to us immediately, but it is a kind of individual choice, a kind of self-expressive choice to represent themselves, and that's fan culture in some ways, or subculture. So the Tomoko then, in a kind of partnership with a Lolita fashion designer in Japan, dresses herself up in a series of these outfits, and then photographs herself and places these photographs in a kind of grid. And in the gallery, we've sort of arranged that so that her photograph is kind of staring across the gallery at the dress. So we have a kind of dialogue going on there, but it sort of speaks to, yeah, all the active thinking that's going on around this, but also the complexity of the answers, I think, to the question.
Erin, did you want to add anything? And thank you so much for sharing some of those links in the chat as well.
Yeah, no, I think both of those artists are kind of directly addressing that question. So I recommend anyone that can go see the show, though I think there will be a publication, a show catalog as well.
There is a gallery guide with essays by the co-curators, Maggie, Erin, Diana, Panely, and the exhibition designer. Yeah, and a lot of illustrations of the artwork. So that's just off the printers this week. We're excited for people to see that too. If it's at the if you can make it to the show, you can take one of those home.
Maggie, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we kind of close things out?
Yeah, maybe just responding to Toda's question. I think the right to be represented is also one of the options that I guess the Japanese society now views women. So when Beata was photographing, really the only woman that is that can be photographed are those working in the entertainment industry, meaning the courtesans, the entertainers, the geisha, or the prostitutes. And I think there is a strong taboo of the presence of the visibility of women at the time. And now I feel like there are more options, as Christopher had just mentioned, about how women taking the cameras to photograph themselves or to photograph the outside world, to shift, to just provide a different perspective of the world. And I think that in itself is really empowering.
That's great, Maggie. Thank you for sharing that with us. I know we are past 1, so I think we might want to wrap up, but I really want to thank the 3 of you so much for being with us today, and to thank all of our audience members for joining us as well. As a reminder for anyone who is local, we will be hosting next Monday at 7:30 p.m. In person at Images Cinema, a screening of the film Weathering with You as part of our art and anime series. And Christopher will be giving a little bit of an intro to that live during the program. If you're especially interested in digging into the anime part of the exhibition, we're super excited to be partnering with Images on that program. So we hope to see you all soon at other future programs, and we're just so grateful to Christopher, Maggie, and Eron for their time and for the beautiful insights into the work on display. I think I certainly feel left with lots of things to think about, and I hope that's true for our audience as well. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you all soon. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.